Good afternoon, good evening, and good morning, wherever you are in the world. Welcome to our Seeds of Justice podcast. And this episode and our next episode, we're going to look at the Biodiversity Convention, the Kunming Convention that just concluded in Kunming in China. And so we're going to look at all things biodiversity and also looking at the Kunming Declaration, some of the announcements that came out of the Kunming conference, and where things are going in terms of the post-2020 global biodiversity framework, living in harmony with nature. And so we're very excited today to be joined by two exceptionally committed individuals who have worked a lot on biodiversity and climate change for a number of years. The co-founder of Parabukas, Attorney Guiao, and there's Nicole Torres, who is the program director for Parabukas. So welcome to our Seeds of Justice. It's great to have you here.
Hi, good evening.
Thanks for having us.
Good afternoon.
We're very happy to be there.
So I thought I'd ask, first of all, Nina, in terms of Parabukas, can you give us a little bit about Parabukas and also yourself and how you sort of came to the journey of environmental law and also the work that you do with Parabukas?
Sure. So Parabukas is an international Asia-based consultancy. We work primarily on environmental, legal, and policy issues. We have a concentration in climate change in particular, but we also do a lot of work between that and biodiversity, sustainable development, and trying to link it with all other socioeconomic difficulties, considering that, the environment is really a cross-sectoral problem. And we felt that was something that needed to be addressed. That was a huge gap that needed to be addressed, especially post adoption of the Paris Agreement. So my Aya De Leon, my co-founder, the co-founder of Parabukas, and I kind of thought that maybe this is, post-Paris, this might be a good time to try exploring how we can close those gaps and make these issues more accessible to people on the ground, more relatable, not just policy and environment wise, directly, but also in terms of communication and understanding all of these concepts that we usually talk about in like an echo chamber. So that's kind of how the Parabukas came about.
Right. So Parabukas is a post-Paris Agreement sort of outcome in some respects. That's exciting. And I think you were sort of engaged in that Paris Agreement discussions and negotiations as well. So maybe you could just also give us a little bit of a story about that.
Sure.
Because that's clearly something that's very important.
I kind of, at one point, I kind of wanted to get a tattoo of the Paris Agreement since I worked on it so much. But thankfully, I got some sense knocked into me. But basically, I got started on environmental work because I was just sick of law school, truthfully. And I needed to take a break. I was thinking of quitting, and I live in an area where Typhoon Katsana, or Ondoy, as it's known in the Philippines, really hit hard. So a lot of friends and family lost property. They were put at risk. Some friends even lost lives. So it was kind of a very rough awakening. I'd been working on climate change just very a bit before that. I left the Philippines on an internship. I needed an excuse to get away from law school for a little bit. I left the Philippines on an internship and happened to be working on climate change. And the moment I got back, Typhoon Ondoy, or Katsana, its international name, hit. So I guess for me, it was like, maybe, this is a sign that I should be working on climate change issues, and it just kind of took off from there. When I started working after taking the bar exam, I immediately started working on climate change issues, and this was around the time that the Paris Agreement was being negotiated. So I was able to take part in a number of projects that had to do with trying to find, the right balance, the right consensus among parties to finally reach, the Paris Agreement. So it was like the whole body of my work for quite some time.
So, and I think, I mean, for me, you know, finding people's passion and that connection is really quite interesting. And I was listening to Cristina Figueres doing a TED talk just recently. I think that's on the road to Glasgow and the COP coming up in November. And there was a young Scottish climate activist who was on stage with the head of Shell. And it was very interesting because the people who are most passionate about doing things on climate change usually can relate to particular events that have brought home it's not just some sort of intellectual discussion about 1.5 degrees C or 2 degrees
Right.
or 3 degrees C. It's about life. It's about living. It's about communities suffering and that real pain. And it was a very powerful presentation because the young activist was also talking about not just Shell's as a company adoption of some sort of target, but the fact that the environmental crimes, the environmental pollution, the environmental consequences of all of these activities are still occurring. And so whether we get to carbon zero by 2030 or 2050, we still have to deal with a whole lot of legacy issues. And that's certainly the case, I think, in biodiversity issues. So how did you sort of move from climate change into biodiversity?
It is. We've really been interested in working on biodiversity like way before. I think people who work in the environmental space really have a tendency to have a great interest in biodiversity, and working on climate change. That's something that we hadn't really encountered previously. Although we do know that the connection, between biodiversity and climate change is really undeniable. It's a critical connection that we need to make. So we kind of made conscious moves to start working in the biodiversity space. We reached out to mentors and friends who had been working there previously and could guide us into working in the space. And thankfully, it was around this time that the Philippines Department of Environment and Natural Resources needed some support leading up to the previous COP that was held in Egypt, which we were thankfully able to provide as members of the Philippine delegation. Nicole was our team leader, and she's been taking point on biodiversity issues since then.
So Nicole, welcome. And in terms of you're currently the program director, I think, for Parabukas, and could you just introduce yourself and give us a little story about yourself and also how you then got engaged in the biodiversity work?
Hi, thanks again so much for having us. So yeah, I'm the programs director for Parabukas, but all that really means is I take point on certain projects and kind of have to know what the entire landscape of our projects looks like. We're a very small team, so keeping track of it is not really that it's not really that taxing because we all know each other and collaborate a lot. But for my environmental work, I've always been interested. I've always been interested in this. I grew up in the north in Baguio City, so I really had the opportunity to see that whole environment change through the years with increasing urbanization and in migration. My work with biodiversity and climate is kind of the reverse of Niners. I started with biodiversity first. So when I was in school, I had the opportunity to intern for civil society organizations in Palawan and Mindanao in the Philippines. I also worked as a paralegal for mining affected communities in Nueva Vizcaya and Marinduque and Indigenous peoples communities as well. And that was my whole lead in to working on biodiversity. So I think we know that shortly after the strategic plan was adopted in 2011, there was a greater interest to bring community rights and community issues into biodiversity. So that's how I got roped in. Like, since you worked on tenure and community rights a lot, you might be interested to work on biodiversity now, something like that. So I started working on biodiversity at the national level in the Philippines when they were putting the fifth national report together for the Secretariat and the convention. That was also around the time that they were working on the Philippine Biodiversity Strategy and Action Plan. So since those processes were proceeding in parallel, I had the chance to support both since the meetings were held together anyway. Um, and from that, that's how I started working in the climate space. So for climate, I was brought on specifically to look at REDD Plus and forests, which are tied very closely to biodiversity. And I work primarily in the civil society side of the negotiation. So advocating, lobbying for specific language in Paris, and seeing that come together mostly in the preamble to the agreements. Yeah.
So I thank you very much. I mean, that's an exciting journey as well, but obviously bringing together the biodiversity and climate is still a challenge, I think. And I know Parabukas, is very focused on public engagement, community participation, and in particular Indigenous people. And I wonder if you could sort of give a little bit of a background in terms of why do you think public participation and engagement with Indigenous peoples is important, both from the climate perspective as well as from the biodiversity outcomes and discussions.
Sure. For the local communities and basically like stakeholder engagement, I can say that one thing that we realized in our work is that there's a huge knowledge gap between what's happening like internationally and at the local level. So, and it's really not because they don't care about these issues or that they don't feel that they're important. It's just that sometimes, given the situation they're in, it's just not relevant to them. They don't have the means or the resources to worry about issues that are really not very solid in terms of how they perceive them. So we felt that one way we needed to be able to address this is to make it relevant to them. Like for the agricultural community, it has to be about food security and agriculture for them to understand how critical the situation is. They might not care so much about how it's working out in terms of industry or in terms of waste management, for example. But agriculture and food security is definitely something that falls within their area of expertise. And it's not just about, telling them that there's a problem, but it's also about looking for solutions that they might already have that haven't been considered before. So it's about an exchange of information, an exchange of knowledge, and kind of bringing to light things or their rights or their maybe some obligations that they hadn't considered before. For Indigenous communities, I think Nicole, as our Indigenous peoples expert, would have a better explanation than I would.
Yeah, well, with Indigenous peoples communities, for a lot of communities, they're not able to participate fully in this process of policy making and decision making. And because they're not able to participate fully, I think that's part of why they don't feel like it's applicable to them, or they don't feel like they derive any benefit from how policy is worded or how policy is made. So I think what we've been trying to do is open up spaces for Indigenous peoples to participate, identify opportunities where they can participate in these discussions and dialogues, and kind of see what they think about these issues and foreground these at these fora. This applies widely to Indigenous peoples in the Philippines. While there are Indigenous peoples organizations and communities that have been able to engage actively in these international spaces, this doesn't happen a lot. So there are communities that also have issues that need to be highlighted, that need to be discussed, and we think that the first step in doing that is in having more dialogues and conversations with them, and also with the national government agencies that are mandated to look after and protect the rights to begin with.
And I mean, the Philippines seems to have been a country that has been quite strong certainly in the ASEAN region on trying to protect or at least identify and support Indigenous communities and the rights of Indigenous people. I'm thinking about free, prior, informed consent. I know that's got some lots of challenges as well. Do you think, and also the Philippines seems to have been a country that has, because of its amazing biodiversity and yet also its situation in terms of typhoons and floods and natural disasters, it seems to be focused on biodiversity protection. Is this something that is sort of seen or recognised or acknowledged at international levels, that there is this commitment to biodiversity and Indigenous people in the Philippines?
Well, there are efforts. The Indigenous Peoples' Rights Act of the Philippines is generally considered a very progressive law in how it allows for the recognition of Indigenous peoples' ancestral domains. Indigenous peoples also appear in the expanded National Integrated Protected Area System law. So there are mechanisms for them to be able to participate in the Protected Areas Management Board that make decisions for the protected area. But these are the things that are written in the policies, that they don't necessarily translate to what's happening on the ground. I mean, it's one thing to mandate that there is an Indigenous people's representative in a board, and another thing to ensure that they are confident and empowered enough to participate in the decision making of that board fully. So there are policy frameworks in place, I guess, that would allow for those intersections between environmental conservation and sustainable development and community rights. But there's still quite a ways to go, especially in terms of coordination and really reaching out and working with communities.
So, yeah, so I mean, I think that's clearly something that is a big challenge. I recall in terms of thinking about biodiversity loss, and I guess talking about something that scientists have said, we're in the sixth extinction, the great loss of species, and whether it's insects or bees or fish, overfishing, the biodiversity losses could be quite sort of devastating and in some way can get a little bit depressing for those who are working in this area. And yet one of the key sort of messages that also is that a lot of the great biodiversity that's in existence and that remains is actually there because it's being protected by Indigenous people. It's in lands that are claimed and or owned by Indigenous people. But there still seems to be a lack of practical measures in place to ensure that that our modern systems actually acknowledge that and protect it. And I'm just wondering, moving on to Kunming and the Biodiversity Convention, is this something that is on the forefront of the discussions about the sort of post-2020 global biodiversity framework, the role of Indigenous people who have essentially protected the areas, a significant proportion of the areas that are still very, very valuable from a biodiversity perspective? Is this something that is there in this post-2020 global biodiversity framework?
Well, yes, to some extent. The rights of Indigenous peoples features very heavily in the Convention on Biodiversity and the Nagoya Protocol on Access and Benefit Sharing. I think more than the other Rio conventions, it's a lot more explicit in the Biodiversity Convention that they have rights, the rights to traditional knowledge, the rights to traditional practices, and how how fair and equitable benefit sharing should arise from these rights. So there is language at least the first draft of the post 2020 Global Biodiversity Framework and the Kunming Declaration to that effect, because it already appears in the convention and the protocols. But civil society organizations, the youth constituency, and the Indigenous peoples constituency has been calling for stronger language. For example, they would like a rights-based approach to be featured more explicitly in the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. And this includes recognizing the rights of Indigenous peoples to their traditionally occupied territories, to their traditionally managed lands, because it's not quite there yet. I think parties have very different approaches to this right to land tenure for Indigenous peoples communities. So maybe that's why it hasn't appeared in the drafts quite yet. But this is something that the civil society is pushing very hard for.
Thanks. And Nina, can I just then sort of turn to you and say, so we've just concluded, I think part one, we've called it of the Kunming conference, and I understand that there's going to be a part two earlier next year. Is that's correct?
Yes.
So given your sort of experience from Paris, from the negotiations around the Paris Agreement, there was a feeling that the Kunming was going to be a conference of parties that was really going to create the next step, essentially the worldwide agreement to stop biodiversity loss. So in terms of the big picture, how did Kunming rate in terms of achieving, or what was its objective first, I guess, and how do you think at least the first part of Kunming has achieved that objective?
Oh, well, it's very different, and it's primarily also because the pandemic really threw a wrench into the process. The thing about multilateral environmental agreements in general is that they're agreed on by consensus. Which means that participation really has to be active, and it really has to agreements have to go through without any formal objections, which is difficult to do online through a Zoom platform or something similar. So for one thing, the pandemic really threw a wrench in that process. They've been trying to work around it by. Oh, sorry. Did you?
Just had a little bit of
did I lose you guys?
Communication glitch.
Am I back?
Yes, you are back.
Okay, cool.
Sorry.
Where did you?
Yeah, we just had a bit of a. Yep. Am I back? We just had a bit of a communications glitch, so I might sort of repeat that question if I can.
Okay, go ahead.
Do that. Okay.
Sure.
Just the joys of internet, which perhaps reinforces your point about the value of participation.
Yes.
So in terms of so we've now had the conclusion of the Kunming part one of the conference, and I guess from your experience with the Paris Agreement and the excitement that went through during that and the negotiations there, what was perhaps the objective of the Kunming COP, and do you think it achieved its objective?
Well, the original objective of the Kunming COP was actually to adopt the next instrument, right? The next legal instrument for the post 2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. It hasn't been able to do, and this is because as I mentioned earlier, the pandemic really threw a wrench in China's plans, and not just China's plans, like the whole world's plans, basically. And it's partly because as we have just experienced, the online platform is very temperamental, and it's not easily accessible for a lot of communities as well. I mean, several members of the African delegations have already flagged how difficult it is for them to participate in the sessions because of their unstable internet connections. And I could say the same thing for the Philippines, right? So it's really been a compromise. They've decided that until parties are able to meet face to face, no substantive decisions will be adopted, so that we can respect the way that decisions are made in multilateral environmental agreements, which is by consensus. So if there are no formal objections, then it can go through. But if the platform isn't sufficient for people to be able to take into consideration all of the elements and all of the proposals that have been put forward, then it might just cause problems later on. So I think people are reserving that for when earnest negotiations face-to-face can actually take place. And because of that, we're running really late. It's already post 2020. So, I mean, it doesn't feel like it since we've been cooped up for a year, but it's, but we're running quite late. And comparing it to the Paris process, which took about 6 years before it came into fruition, I'm a bit concerned, of course, about the timeline, considering that the first draft which came out was very long. And obviously something that needs to be pared down. So yeah, so it might be quite an uphill climb, but I hope we get there soon.
And so this will lead into the part 2 of the COP. I think in April, May next year. Is that correct?
Yes, so part 2, if all goes well, will happen around April, May next year, although there's going to be a working group meeting on the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework in January 22 in Geneva. Again, fingers crossed if all goes well.
And so I think, there's also been a lot of criticism now about the Glasgow climate COP because of the challenges to participation again because of COVID. And it obviously with biodiversity, it seems that community participation, NGO participation, civil society participation is very important because that's where a lot of the biodiversity impacts are felt. Do you think this is also something that can be addressed before May, or is it something that's going to be an ongoing challenge for us just because of the response or the challenges of responding to COVID?
Well, I think it's definitely going to be an ongoing challenge, considering it's really quite difficult to get anywhere else in the world, especially to farther flung areas. And for people in local communities or indigenous communities that have limited access, during the normal times to these kinds of gatherings and to representatives who could bring their views forward in international platforms, this makes it doubly difficult for them to get their views, have their views heard. And aside from that, another barrier maybe would be, of course, how the COP presidency for biodiversity decides to approach this issue. So for the climate change Paris Agreement, it was really, there was a lot of time for various sectors and various stakeholders to be engaged. But since the Biodiversity Convention, for the next instrument, we're really rushing and we're really cramming. That's going to be difficult. And at least I think for the French presidency, under the climate change agreement, they were really engaged for a number of years in building trust among parties and consulting stakeholders and trying to present themselves and to be, a trustworthy broker in terms of adopting a new agreement. The difficulty with this is that China has been suffering, of course, from the pandemic as well, and hasn't been able to be as active, perhaps, as it would like to be. And another thing that is to be considered, perhaps, is I think Nicole can talk about this as well, but their insertion of ecological civilization in the text and the kind of approach they want to take, which ecological civilization is kind of like the Chinese concept of sustainable development, but it also integrates, political governance, social beliefs of the Chinese culture that that might be in conflict with certain principles that the international community would like to promote.
So Nicole, did you want to sort of follow up on that issue? Because we'll move into the actual Kunming Declaration, which did acknowledge, I think, the role of ecological civilization, which is now part of the constitution of the People's Republic of China. So, I mean, it is very much trying to, and certainly the news reports talked about how this was the first time that the UN had adopted ecological civilization. It doesn't quite seem that it was adopted. It was certainly noted and recognised. But an ecological civilization is very much a key initiative of President Xi Jinping and his predecessors. But it does have some impacts when we've been talking about sustainable development for the last 30 years, I guess.
Yes, well, as we know, it's a very Chinese concept, and it's been reproduced as the theme of CBD COP 15. So the theme of CBD COP 15 will focus on ecological civilization quite heavily. It's very interesting because the previous themes of the COP have been more, I would say, general, like investing in biodiversity or ensuring sustainable use, general things like that. So this focus on ecological civilization is interesting, and I think speaks to how China has wanted to position itself as kind of a global leader in these environmental spaces. So we know that very recently they've announced that they would stop investing in more coal projects abroad. They will try very hard to reach carbon neutrality before 2060. They've been working very hard with the European Union on joint approaches to end deforestation, to create sustainable supply chains. And part of that joint commitment with the EU is trying to achieve they term an ambitious and realistic post-2020 global biodiversity framework. So how their concept of an ecological civilization will fit into what is ambitious but also realistic will be really interesting to see, especially as things shape up in January, if they're able to meet face-to-face in Geneva.
So Nicole and Nina, look, thank you very much for your time. We're going to take a bit of a break, and when we get back, we'll then go into the sort of a bit more of discussion on the Kunming Declaration. But thank you very much for your time today and your insights, and we look forward to joining you next week on our next episode of Seeds of Justice, when we'll go in a bit more detail on the Kunming Declaration, the Global Biodiversity Framework, the Living in Harmony ideas, and then perhaps thinking about some of the practical outcomes. I mean, there was the Biodiversity Fund announced by President Xi Jinping of 1.5 billion yuan, which is 233 million US dollars, and certainly that concept about ecological civilization and how that might impact on the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. But can I thank you very much on behalf of the Asian Research Institute for Environmental Law and the Asian Development Bank Environmental Law Champions. Thank you, Parabukas, for your attendance. Thank you, Nina and Nicole. We look forward to welcoming you back next week.
Cool. Thank you very much. Thank you.